Oh, that's fun. Good morning. We're just gonna get people signed in, logged in. We'll start in 2 minutes. Good morning, good morning. Everyone get your copy, get comfortable. Get started in 1 more minute. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Hegarty. I'm the program director for the Napa Valley Grape Growers and Farm Worker Foundation. Welcome to our spring roundtable on farm strategies for drought. So I'm here to cover a quick housekeeping slides for you, and then we'll get started. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank the businesses that you see on this screen. They are both the MVG and Farm Worker Foundation annual sponsors. We can't thank our partners enough for their support of our missions and making valuable events like these available to you. Now, on to the exciting stuff. For those of you who have been regulars at our Zoom webinars, you've heard me say the same instructions over and over again, but today we're excited because we have a new set of rules for you. So first, what remains consistent is our question and answer box. So the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen is where you can put in all questions for all presenters. As this is a spring roundtable, we'll be moderating questions ourselves, and then you can ask questions as well. So feel free to put them in that box at any time. Next, we are implementing a quick poll at the end of this webinar. So don't get itchy fingers and log off too soon, because different from our Survey Monkey that you get when you close your browser, this one will be in the webinar, and it is only 3 questions, but it's crucial that you answer it because it allows us to maintain our funding, our grant funding from CDFA and USDA. So please, please, please take the time to answer 3 simple questions. And finally, we're incredibly excited to announce that we have Spanish interpretation available for this webinar. So I will go through those instructions right now. So to access the interpretation, all you do is click the circle that says interpretation. It might be a globe, it might be 3 little dots if you're on a phone or a smaller device. And you want to select the language that you want to hear. So English or Spanish are your 2 options. And you can mute original audio. That might not be necessary if you're just clicking either language. So I'd encourage you all to do that right now as we introduce the speakers. So I am thrilled to welcome our panel of speakers. First, we have Tom Chaplin of Thule Technologies. Tom is the CEO and co-founder of Thule, which helps hundreds of growers make irrigation decisions across California. Welcome, Tom. Along with Tom, we have Michael Wolf of Michael Wolf Vineyard Services. Founded in 1997, Michael Wolf Vineyard Services has over 40 clients, including both independent growers and wineries, and represents over 650 acres in the Napa Valley. Hi, Mike. Joining him is Chris Lowe of Vine Balance Consulting. Dr. Lowe has been studying, researching, teaching, and consulting in viticulture since 2000. She's worked in vineyards ranging in approach from sustainable to biodynamic, and has consulted with small vineyard owners, large winery corporations, and everything in between. So welcome, Chris. And finally, I'd like to welcome Randy Heidzen of Vineyard Professional Services. Randy joined VPS in 2013 and acquired the company in 2017. Congrats. Before moving to Templeton, Randy lived in Napa for 10 years, where he managed a number of respected vineyards. So welcome, Randy. Thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully your interpretation has been selected already. And with that, I will turn it over to MVG's Associate Director, Sonia DeLuca, who will be moderating today's discussion on farming strategies for drought. So Sonia, I will let you get us started.
All right, thanks, Emily. And a huge thanks to each of you for your participation today. I'm going to start with questions to the group, and then we'll move on to specific individual questions for each of you. But before that, I just wanted to set the stage a little and give a little bit of background about why we're here discussing this topic today. The drought conditions we're experiencing are, of course, top of mind for farmers throughout the state, as well as in the Napa Valley. And in researching how 2021 compares to other years, it was troubling, to say the least. In the past 20 years, the two worst stretches of drought for the Western United States came in 2003 and 2013. But what scientists fear is happening right now appears to be the beginning stages of something even more severe. And of course, as we head into the dry summer season, the stage is set for an escalation of these extreme dry conditions, with reservoirs, irrigation ponds, and the lake empty, and another dangerous fire season potentially ahead. It's a dangerous benchmark if you think about it, as 2012 to 2015 was the state's driest consecutive 4-year stretch since record keeping began in 1896. And according to climate experts, this year's drought is steadily approaching the peak severity of this last one. So there is light, though. As each of you have said to me, grapevines are extremely resilient. And thankfully, we farm a crop that doesn't require as much water as other ag crops do. So we can learn from past seasons and try to prepare ourselves for this year. And we thank all of you for coming to share your expertise and knowledge with us today. So let's start with some questions to the group about farming strategies and management practices that growers should consider for this season. So the first question, how did the vines surprise you in the last drought, and what are you looking out for this year? Let's start with Mike.
I think, Sonia, the biggest surprise in the last drought, and I think it's reasonable to expect it in this drought, is in really simple terms just how smart the vines are. That they have this remarkable ability to compensate, and we've become so controlling as farmers, and sort of unaccepting, if you will, of what nature gives us. I mean, that's going to be one of the biggest tests of this vintage, is taking what we've got and working with it. But I think just the vine's natural ability to compensate, for me, was the biggest lesson in the last droughts. Plus the fact that it's only 1 year. We need to kind of keep that in mind. We get to do this again next year.
Chris, Randy, Tom, anything to add to that?
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, to add to Mike's kind of inherent intelligence in our grapevines, I think that additionally the rootstock response and the wisdom or folly of our choices 5, 10, 15 years ago when we planted the vineyards really became apparent. And even with even with changing management patterns or trying to add irrigation or do other remediation, we just couldn't overcome the decisions we'd made in years past in terms of what stock we had. And so we were kind of stuck with whatever that rootstock, however that responded to drought. I thought that was pretty fascinating. It validated a lot of stuff we did and also made us look real stupid on some ranches.
Yeah, I can chime in here. It was really humbling. I completely agree with both Randy and Mike. It can be really humbling when you see what a drought tolerant rootstock and a block planted on drought tolerant rootstocks can accomplish in terms of how they will actually use water so efficiently and grow canopy and hold on to it and not give up without a fight. This year is really severe though. So just in terms of things that I'm looking out for this year, I'm normally a person that likes plant-based monitoring and ET model systems. When I think about irrigation, I'm watching the soil a lot more carefully for places that you do have soil probes or neutron probes, or even just those calculations you might have done or have had done for you at the beginning of the season about how much water you had and how much you are losing. And again, always just visual observations. It might be a very short window when your shoot tips are happy and when they're done. And at some level, if you have water, you might really want to try to jumpstart them. But then on another level, you also might need to respect what your vines are going to give you this year in terms of canopy and make your decisions after that.
One of the things that I've noticed when we're monitoring the canopy size and the ET and the water stress throughout the season with our sensors in hundreds of vineyards throughout Napa Valley is how the vines adjust to each vintage. In the drier years, we see smaller size canopies. With our data, we see that the canopies didn't get as big, and those vines are really regulating how much water they potentially could use. That they're growing smaller canopies, so later in the summer when the evaporative demand is high, they're going to use less water. And because they're using less water, they don't get as stressed. One of the things that always surprises me about my data set, our data set, is I'll look at a dry year and compare it to a wet year, and the differences in how much water stress the vines get by the late summer isn't that much. And part of it, of course, is the smart vines, as Mike likes to talk about, that they've kind of regulated their size to the vintage and are adjusting to the season. And part of it also is the smart farmer that's keeping an eye on them and making sure that things are going as planned. So it's true that they're smart, but that doesn't mean I echo what Chris has to say about we must be vigilant. One of the things I remember from 2015 was a lot of our customers saying, oh yeah, and that block over there, we really got surprised. That block just went from moderate stress to a lot of stress really quick. And it got away from us and it surprised us. And I want to kind of give some numbers around why that happens and what to look out for this year. So in a typical year in Napa, in the wet years of 2017, 2018, and 2019, growers apply in the months of June, July, August, and September, growers apply about 70 gallons per vine. And in those same months, the amount of water that the vines use is 425 gallons per vine. So in other words, the vines are using a lot more water in a typical year than what you guys apply through the irrigation system. So that begs the question, where are the vines getting all that water? Well, they're getting that water from the stored winter rainfall in the soil. And in a year like this, and they're getting it not just in the stored winter rainfall in the soil in the top, 1.5 foot of soil right under the emitter, those vines are mining the entire soil volume between the rows, everything available to them. They're mining a huge block of soil per vine. And in a year like this, that reservoir isn't as full as it typically is. You guys only got 10 inches of water in Napa. And you're gonna see, it's just like many of your ponds, that reservoir is not as full as it normally is. And you're gonna see those vines that are moderately stressed later in the season. I think you should be looking out for keeping a close eye and making sure they don't crash suddenly. Vines that are pretty less stressed or moderate to not very stressed, I think they're going to be smart and adjust. But those ones that you always kind of worry about, those blocks that tend to get more stressed, be careful that they might crash suddenly. I don't know, Chris and Randy and Mike, is that something you guys sometimes see, or how do you guys approach that? with vines suddenly getting, do you feel like there's some blocks that you really need to keep your eye on in drier conditions because the stress sort of goes like that?
Yeah, I mean, our approach to it, Tom, and I think you've seen it, is we do try to maintain a moderate amount of stress from day one. Well, that's not really true. I mean, there are two times that we pay a lot of attention to wanting the vines to be as happy as they can be. One is right around now at bloom time. We really try hard to avoid water stress. And then if the water resources are available, keeping the canopies healthy after veraison is a pretty big deal. And as the world gets warmer, that's a bigger deal. And I know that's something we'll get to later in this conversation. But I totally agree that vines that are too luxuriant and have too easy of a time early in the season are much more prone to crashing and burning when it gets hot out.
What are these luxuriant vines you talk about? I'm not familiar with those down here.
Well, you don't see those, Randy.
Okay. Yeah, to Mike's point about maintaining stress from day one, I feel like, especially for East Paso, where our average rainfall is between 3 and 9 inches, it feels like we're always, well, it doesn't feel, we are always trying to catch up. We use winter rainfall as a tool to flush our soils because we also have very poor quality water. But in essence, we don't stop irrigating from post-harvest, well, ever. So I mean, maybe the frequency changes, but we're irrigating through the winter. Mark Batney, our extension officer down here, has a great stat that for every 3 inches of reduction in your rainfall, you need to add an additional acre inch of water or inch of water. So as we look at what we typically expect, and we're in a drought as well down here, fascinating, it's not as dire as maybe you guys in a percentage change. We didn't get as much water, but we usually don't get that much water anyway. We then use that model as sort of a catch-up. We know, we hope for rain because in the winter, because that should flush things, but we just know intuitively that we're going to be adding water in February, March, April, up to a budget as we try and keep there to fill our soils.
Okay, let's move on to sort of coming off of that. Are there specific management techniques that you're using this year, that you wouldn't use in a normal rainfall year? So any sort of specific, practices that you guys are implementing in the vineyards this year as compared to other years when we do have normal rainfall. Chris, we'll start with you.
Sure. And I mean, we're having this discussion here in late May, but depending on if you were a serious optimist or a pessimist in terms of rainfall and when you were pruning, some of this thought process was happening in January, February, March. So, I mean, I had places where we adjusted pruning, shorter canes, one bud spurs in our blocks that we knew were going to be thirsty. We knew were weak anyways, based on whatever reason, the soil, the rootstock choice, whatever it was. Those are adjustments that were made really early. And in terms of choosing early irrigations, and again, these are for people who have some water, have a good well that they're not worried about. I took the opportunity right after bud break to try to convince people to do longer sets. So often everyone's like, oh, well, it takes me this long to get around my vineyard, so I can only do 3 gallons, 4 gallons, 4 gallons just to get around in a week. And I was like, hey, it's not, we're this dry, we're this much of a deficit. Turn it on overnight if you want. It's going to be okay. So longer irrigations earlier in the season is not something that you have to do in Napa all the time, but that's absolutely something that I did this year.
With our sensor network, we monitor how much irrigation people are applying. And we've been doing this since 2014. And this is the first year where I've seen how much water people apply in the spring to be very different than all the previous years. And this is something you guys all see when you drive around the valley, but I can put some numbers behind it. In the average year, growers apply 6 gallons per vine from March 1 to June 1, and they do it in 2 events. And this year, I'm seeing growers apply 12 gallons per vine, and they're doing it in 4 events. Those are the average amount of irrigation events we see across our sensor network on the valley floor and hillsides. It's actually the median. But I just wanted to weigh in on what Chris was saying, that people have definitely been approaching irrigation differently this year so far.
Yeah, in addition to all the comments I had about irrigating and trying to catch up, which is sort of just the background farming that we are doing here every year, it seems like. But in terms of active management changes, the real obvious one is row middle management. We took the action of saying if we were going to be having full cover, just do every other row. If we were going to be doing every other row, disc everything. If you already were disking everything, disc it all again. Just kind of saying, let's go one step back. And this happened in March, because usually we have these miracle marches. And I think I should point out that annual rainfall in terms of how we see flushing, but also in terms of how you're doing your water budget for the season. Not all winter rain is the same, right? So the last, I think it was 18 or 19 and 20, we got all of our rain in late February and March down here. And that really impacted, even though it wasn't a high total amount, having rain right before bud break really helped in terms of our nitrogen mineralization, our early canopy growth. That was beneficial. Even though we would have liked more, we'd take the rain right before bud break. And this year, all that rain came in that late January storm. And so we, after doing the row middle management action, like in mid-March, late March, when we saw we weren't going to get any rain, in early April, we just made a mandate across our acres that pull up your fertilizer applications closer to beginning of April, put in a little bit extra N, or shift your budgets. If we were going to do more N kind of later in the season, move it to now, because we recognize that we were just going to have low nitrogen mineralization since we had such dry soils right at bud break.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, just to kind of support what Randy is saying. I mean, for us, typically, we don't fertilize very early in the season, and I was just acutely aware and concerned about just nutrient availability for the plants early in the season. And if for any number of reasons we didn't want to irrigate, even if we had water, we've been incorporating some nutrient stuff into our spray program, which is a little bit out of the ordinary for us early in the season. Typically we do it as a remedial sort of process after we get petiole analysis back. So I think that's really a huge one. And, we'll probably, talk more about this later, but I've been concerned, in situations where we do have adequate water supplies, of not artificially building a big vine, and creating that situation that Tom explained so well. We can fool the vine early in the season into thinking that it has enough water and it'll grow a big canopy. And then come July, that other 400 gallons that it needs just simply isn't out there for it. And I think, obviously that the time for those decisions is past, but I do think that the fertilization thing was a huge piece for us early in the season.
And that's a good segue, Mike. I think one question that we had was sort of, have you been farming this year to artificially reproduce the same conditions of a normal year with canopy size and fruit load and et cetera? Or have you been actually farming to the current conditions? You know, we are in May, so we're a little ways into the season. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how you guys are managing that this year.
So I'll try to not get on my soapbox, but you know, of all of the things, all of the kind of subtopics that this big topic brings up, is I just think it's a huge mistake to artificially inflate the vines, that for any number of reasons, stretching from vine health in this growing season and going forward, to wine grape quality, that farming to the vintage is really important. We're not building Toyotas here, and vintage variation is something we should embrace. It doesn't make the farming necessarily easier, but I just feel very strongly that farming to the vintage is the right thing to do.
Why is that, Mike? Why do you feel strongly that's true? What have you seen in vineyards where people aren't farming to the vintage, or how does that? Could you elaborate on your reasoning behind that?
Well, I don't think we've seen it yet, Tom. I think that the consequences of 2 really low rainfall years in succession are going to catch up with people in July and August. I mean, you can support the vine much more effectively early in the season, but if it's a smaller vine, you know, it takes fewer resources to do that. Later on, if you have that big canopy, it's going to blow off more water and you're not going to be able to replenish it. So I think, you know, you're setting yourself up for failure by doing that. And I also think that, you know, creating a quote normal crop in a drought situation is probably not a great idea. I mean, I don't think this is a year where you want to see average size berries. I don't think it's a year where you want to see average size leaves. I think it's a year where you want to see everything scaled back a little bit. You know, we talk about balance, you know, ad nauseum, but a vine can be balanced and smaller.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you, Mike. There's an amazing opportunity this year for parts of the valley that feel like they struggle with high quality potential because of vigor to achieve something extraordinary. So you might really have a magic well and really need to have a large yield this year, overcoming losses from last year for many other reasons. But I do agree with you that you should think about the opportunity for quality and what happens when vines do experience moderate drought stress from set to veraison, and try to accomplish that. And also there are folks out there that are looking at a dry pond or a nearly dry pond. And for them, I liked your approach of, I don't mind them trying to build some canopy now, but because nothing's going to happen if you have just 6-inch shoots, if you're that dire. So build a little bit now, get through bloom, get into set. And then my next big phenological event, like you said, would be use it at veraison, right after veraison. But definitely don't try to inflate it, for sure.
Yeah, on the topic of building canopy early in the season, you know, when I moved down here, the 2 worst pieces of equipment we bought were a hedger and a leafer. That if you guys need either of them, let me know. Haven't had to use those at all. But I think it's important to note, because I heard quality, I heard stress, and then how it relates to your canopy. One of the things that we are very concerned about is separate from drought, but sort of usually tracks with it, is those late season heat waves. We have really incredibly high vapor pressure deficits down here. We have huge heat waves. You have to have a pool if you live here in Paso Robles because August is miserable. So for us, building a canopy is twofold. One is it's our sun protection. We don't do any leafing, maybe some interior laterals if they push at all. But two, the leaf age and the ability for that vine to have an active transpiration and do some cooling of just the leaves. Obviously the berries aren't doing it, but to have the ability to have an active canopy with the right age leaves in August and September when our subsoil has, during drought or during just low rainfall areas like here, you know, your subsoil by August is toast. Like we just don't see, we're monitoring with soil moisture monitors. So I would challenge a little bit back to folks in Napa where perhaps you definitely have better soils than us, but perhaps if you have moisture down at depth in a drought year, if that's going to be limited, if you're looking at it and it's you know multiple or it's much lower than it's ever been, if you don't have active leaves and a sufficient canopy come August, September, that part of your vine's engine, that part of your root's ability to pull up water, it may shockingly correct the upper parts of the vine, and you may dehydrate the fruit, drop canopy, drop leaves, spill the beans on the wine quality.
And that's similar to some of what I've seen in our data in the previous drought, is that there's these vines that were vineyards where they're already pushing it on stress and pretty high stress late in the season. And the grower in Napa expected the vines to be able to continue to ride it out. But there wasn't that reservoir of soil water throughout the vineyard. And the vines, the upper part of the vine, the part we can see, suddenly did not look so good. And it happened really quickly. I want to go back to that question of whether or not we could artificially reproduce the conditions of a normal year. And I firmly believe that we can't reproduce the conditions with our drip systems of a normal year. And I want to run through some of the basic numbers behind a soil water budget to try to demonstrate that point. And I want to start by talking about what an acre inch is. We talk about an inch of water all the time when we're talking about bigger picture water management issues. But whenever we actually talk about irrigation in viticulture, we always talk about gallons per vine. So what's the connection between those two concepts? And I want to start there. An acre inch of water is 27,000 gallons of water. And the way you define what an acre inch of water is you take one of those big pools that's in Paso Robles that's an acre big, and you fill that up with just an inch of water. If you put in 27,000 gallons of water in a pool that's the size of an acre, it'll fill to a depth of 1 inch. So that's what an acre inch is. And now I want to translate that to what an acre inch is in terms of gallons per vine. In Napa, the typical, the median vine by row spacing is 8 by 5 feet. And typically each vine has 1 gallon per vine that it's getting for an hour that the irrigation system runs. That might be on 2 emitters per vine at ½ gallon each, or it might be on 1 emitter per vine at 1 gallon. So typically we have 8 by 5 spacing and we have 1 gallon per vine. If you want to apply an acre inch of water through your drip system, you have to run your irrigation system for 25 hours. So you have to run it for a whole day if you got to get an acre inch of water applied. So in a typical good rain event in Napa, we get 1.5 to 2 inches of rain we can get in a good rain event in Napa. So that's like running your irrigation system for 25 to 50 hours. So that's some of the basics of a water budget and some of the terms behind it. Now I want to take this one step further and talk about how rainfall is different than drip irrigation. Rainfall covers the entire vineyard, right? You're applying rain in the row. The rain falls on the row middles. It just doesn't go in that sort of small area under the emitter. It goes throughout that entire vineyard, and the vines are mining the water throughout that entire soil volume during the summer. Again, that's how a vineyard in Napa can use 425 gallons of water in the summer months, but you only apply 70 gallons of water, it's because in a typical year, the vines are mining that entire soil volume. And I want to bring up this idea of, okay, with a drip system, let's say you're trying to, if you apply an inch of water through the drip system, so 25 gallons per vine, you're not applying that just across, evenly distributed across that whole acre. You're applying it in a pretty small area. And if we think through what that means in terms of a wetted area. So the wetted area, let's just assume that the wetted area under an emitter is 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet. If you apply water for 25 hours on that 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet, you're spreading out the water over a small area compared to a much bigger area. You're not spreading out the water over 8 by 5 feet. You're spreading out the water over, you know, a much smaller area. And you would fill that smaller area to a depth of 7 inches. So if you run your irrigation system for 25 hours to apply an acre inch, you're actually applying 7 inches over a pretty small area. And the typical water holding capacity of a soil in Napa is around 9 inches. So if you apply water for more than 25 hours, you're like, oh no, we're in a dry year. I'm just going to run my irrigation system. I got plenty of water. I'm going to run my irrigation system for 100 hours and get everything back up to water holding capacity, to field capacity. It's not going to work because you're applying that water over a small area. So after 25 hours, you're going to reach, the soil is going to become saturated and you're going to push all the water out the bottom. You can't, with a drip irrigation system, evenly distribute the water throughout the whole vineyard. And I'm finally going to wrap up my point because I realize I've been talking probably more than my share here. But the point is that you got to be, when you're farming later this season, it's important to realize that that whole soil reservoir hasn't been refilled the way it typically gets in Napa. And you don't have that sort of control to fill that soil profile unless you're running your sprinklers. And you got to be mindful of what that could mean for how much buffer your vineyard has for dealing with heat events and for dealing with the evaporative demand throughout the summer.
Thanks, Tom. So let's shift a little to timing. You know, if we think about how much water do you have as a grower, it's kind of a two-part question. Do you use it when you need it or as you need it, or do you save it for later in the season? Inevitably, we will have heat events throughout the summer. And so sort of talking about that water management as well as, you know, sort of practices and how you all are planning to protect the fruit sort of before and during these heat events. Start with Randy.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to hear Chris and Michael's, because I think soil-wise and climate-wise, I think that there's probably more specifics for Napa than maybe Paso could relate to. But I will tell you the process down here, kind of talk about this irrigating all year round. There's a French consultant named Chonet or Chones, which for the Spanish interpretation side of the seminar, that is a professor's name, not a noun. His recommendation has always been fill the profile right before bud break, then let it ride, and then adjust in season, like through bloom, through lag phase, based on what your canopy needs, and then fill back up again as you hit veraison. So in terms of how we've managed timing of irrigation, we are again irrigating throughout the winter, trying to hit our not necessarily field capacity, be hard to hit that, but as much as we can prior to bud break, and then we start to taper off and figure and kind of monitor vine response and need as we go through the season.
Okay, I'll chime in. Yeah, and again, this is really different in Napa compared to how much water you have. Some people really have a good well, and they're kind of like, I'll be okay, and we might be, you know, doing a cautionary tale here. But I'm going to address those folks that don't, that they know that they started the season knowing that they were going to be limited, and what decisions do you make then? Bloom, for sure. I wanted to make sure that folks going through bloom, that was the first phenological point that I thought was important. So pretty much everyone, I said, let's put on some water before bloom, 2 weeks before. Let's make sure we get through there. If you happen to have an early variety that bloomed in our Mother's Day heat spike, so that was a little bit tricky, but don't be stressed during bloom because it all starts there. After that, if you're going to meter it out again, I would say try to hold off until veraison. And then that's the next point in the season, just like Randy said. However, if you're looking at a pond and you're like, I'm losing 1/4 of an inch a day, I'm losing whatever it is following evaporative demand. Don't try to save it for the end of the season. I do think you need to hit those 2 points of the year and then see how it goes. You have to kind of react to what you need in real time. In terms of saving it for a heat spike, the only people that are going to be using overhead sprinklers are those with that magic well. I like leaf coverage for a heat spike personally, so rethink your leafing. Maybe do less or not at all this year for sure. And then there's shade cloth, but that's expensive and difficult, and maybe not always cost effective or possible for everyone.
Mike, anything to add there?
Yeah, just a little, Sonia. I mean, I really totally agree with everything that Chris just said. I've been thinking, even though we're not in a position where we have a lot of reservoirs as our irrigation source, but thinking about, you know, your ideal timing of water use and the reality of it. And, you know, that nightmare of watching it evaporate while you're waiting for veraison. And I think you start in a lot of it, and we haven't talked about it very much to this point, but some of what we're going to need to be doing is making some compromises. Yeah, you don't necessarily want to be using your water in July, but maybe that's keeping your canopy somewhat intact. Maybe it's protecting your vine health for next year. I think, you know, we can't just be thinking about this year as we're making our farming decisions, our irrigation decisions. We have to be thinking about, you know, the fact that a lot of what's going on in those plants now is going to determine what happens in the following year. I also worry about wells, and I think Randy has, you know, some really good thoughts about that. You know, typically in Napa Valley, the well is fine until it isn't. We're not great around here about maintenance and regular testing, and it's certainly a shortcoming. So I think, you know, that's another thing that keeps one awake at night is, you know, what if you flip the switch one morning and air comes out? So again, Randy, I think, has some really good thoughts about that, but the reservoir thing is a really tough decision for people to make. And the 1 or 2 situations we have, we are trying to hoard it, you know, and thinking about it's going to be more important a little bit later in the season if we've been able to get an adequate amount of growth out of those vines. I think the other thing, while I'm talking about it, is to realize that not only are we lacking winter rain, a lot of us didn't have the opportunity after so-called harvest last year to do what we usually do. Whether that was a nice deep irrigation, whether it was some additional fertilizer, whether it was some soil inoculant stuff, you know, there was no power, there was no access. There were a lot of reasons that couldn't happen. So I think it's really important to not push vine health aside as we're thinking about how to get through this vintage.
And so we've been talking a lot about water management, and obviously when we say drought, we all think water. But shifting gears a little bit and wanted to ask what strategies or tools you guys are using that are not directly related to water management. If you have anything to share in that regard too. We can start with Chris.
Sure, and I think we've talked about little pieces of this already, but vineyard floor management for sure. Just like Randy said, we've done more tillage this year and earlier. Absolutely, just to reduce that competition. Cover crops use a lot of water, and that kind of freaked me out when in areas that we did end up with a decent cover crop after that last March rain. And I was looking at my ET values from the Thule sensors of how much water I was losing. It's like, get that down. I don't want to lose that water from the soil in that, right now, which is makes me rethink some of that for sure. And also suckering early, quickly, if possible, if you had the labor, really directing all that growth to fewer growing points. That's some of the stuff I did for sure earlier in the season.
Yeah, I everything that Chris said, plus I think some of the new intriguing stimulants or some of these yeast companies are coming out with their sprays you put on now or throughout the season that are supposed to reduce evapotranspiration or otherwise help maintain water status. We've played with some of these products for 2 or 3 years. I'm not going to recommend or say that any of them are working better than the others, but there's a whole new one out this year from another one of these wine yeast companies that says it's going to completely help us keep our water in the vines and reduce evapotranspiration. So we're playing with a lot of these different foliars just to see what they do, and we have some tools that help us monitor evapotranspiration. So we'll see if that works out.
So I have a question, probably mostly for Chris, maybe a little bit for Tom. And there's clearly a trend in the valley towards more permanent cover crops. Permanent as in permanent, as in don't touch the ground. You're sequestering more carbon, you're increasing the soil's ability to hold whatever water it has. So what do we think about that?
I'll answer with some numbers. That's I sometimes joke with you, Mike, that I hide behind my numbers and data because I don't actually know what farming is like, and the trickiness of when you can actually get in and manage that cover crop and all those operational things you have to consider. Cover crops can use they use a lot of water. So throughout the season, the number that comes to mind is it's between 6 and 10 inches, depending on that vigor of that cover crop and how tall it is and how full it is. So, in a typical rainfall year in Napa, you get 28 inches of rain or more, and it's okay that you actually want to use that cover crop as a tool to dry down the vineyard some and be able to hit some pre-veraison stress. But in a year like this, when you have 10 inches of rain and your cover crop, it's not as vigorous as your cover crop is using between 6 and 10 inches, it makes you think whether or not makes you think you either have to figure out a way to make money from that cover crop itself, or whether or not you should be managing that cover crop so that there's more water around for the vine.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this year is so extreme that you had to make that decision based on the conditions. And I love no-till vineyards. They're great. And in the right situation where they're on the right soil, you pick the right cover. We talk about cover crops really generally. There's a lot of different species. You pick the right one, and you also have the right rootstock there and the right spacing and the right tools to manage everything. If you've got all those things together, permanent cover crop is great. But when faced with this serious amount of deficit, you have to look at that water loss. And that was that became a sacrifice. And I'll fully admit that still feel like I'm completely learning where it comes to cover crop and tillage and compost and carbon sequestration, and how all of those factors with all of their different variables in a system, make a healthy vineyard.
We just completed we had a grant through the Healthy Soils program to do a demonstration project of row middle management, 4 ranches, 4 different treatments. Fascinatingly, when I moved down here, I knew what the concept was, but I wasn't familiar that you could actually do it on a regular basis of chem mowing. So kudos to John Crossland. So we included that as one of our 4 treatments: full till, no till, every other row, chem mow. One of the surprising findings out of that was, and we did all the different soil biological studies and sent it out for the PLFA analysis. We maintained or increased biological activity in our soils even with chem mowing. Now you have to get over the mental hurdle of using a herbicide as a banded spray, but we absolutely are still doing that in some ranches where we want to maintain full cover, either for some of our soil remediation work or for machine harvesting for some traction later in the season where we just have to have cover to climb hills. Chem mow used appropriately can be another option to reduce ET while still maintaining the benefits of soil cover.
Okay, I have one question here in the box that I'll ask you guys now. So it's sort of a crystal ball type question as we close up our group questions. So if you knew what next year was going to be like, what would that change your ideas about how you're managing this year? Let's start with Mike.
That's a hard one. I think, well, if we assume that next year is going to be a normal rainfall year, I think what we would still be focusing on the health of the vines and the health of the soil this year. I think we need to focus on, in the short term, what we can control and what we can't control, and just give up on the stuff we can't control, and focus really hard on the places where we can make a meaningful difference. So I would think, again, it's about vine health more than anything else, and just making sure that the vines are able to weather what they get next year. If the crystal ball says we're going to have another 10-inch winter, then I think one of the things that Chris touched on earlier becomes super important. You need to be thinking about that when you prune. And you need to be thinking about that when you plant your cover crop this fall. You need to be thinking about that when you look at your budget and see if you can handle a big compost application. And maybe you band that compost over the on the weed strip and treat it as mulch, and a lot of those things. I don't know that we would change a lot of what we're doing if the crystal ball said next year was going to be back to something more normal.
I think building on Mike's point about compost, exactly what he was talking about in terms of the above ground activities you can do. But I would say build your reservoir, strengthen your reservoir as best you can. So I know most growers up there probably already are doing some in-row ripping or compost applications or otherwise building soil health in the winter. But if you're not ripping but every 3 or 5 years based on compaction trends or stuff like that, maybe pull it forward. Maybe rip channels, hydraulic rip channels, so you can break up any barriers or any other hindrances to your root zone to pull in moisture and to retain moisture. Whatever rain you get, you want it to be available to the vine. So I would bring forward any ripping plans to this fall and do it before rains, put compost and then incorporate that compost, build your soil moisture holding capacity through maybe a real aggressive compost application, so you can build some of that tilth and organic matter, and really think about having 4 or 5 months this winter to not only build the reservoir, but then fill it. Consider off-season irrigation, consider ways to try and maximize what you can walk into next April with in terms of your moisture holding capacity and quantity.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And my mind immediately went to new plantings because you have to protect your investment. And so things that I would do if I knew next year was going to be like that, I'd cut all the fruit off my really young vines, 1 years, even if you thought they were going to produce this year, I'd cut that off yesterday. I'd call the nurseries and maybe ask them to hold over my vines for next year. Pretty please. And I'll be a little aggressive here. I would bulldoze my 1 to 114 rootstock blocks because they're not sustainable in drought years. They just don't make sense, especially if you have a questionable water supply.
Okay, we're going to move on to some individual questions, and we'll start with Randy. You farmed here in Napa as well as in Paso. And West Paso and Napa are typically climatologically similar with rainfall and temperature in most years. However, Napa is more like East Paso this year. So what have you seen work well that you would recommend growers here be doing? And we've talked a little bit about this, but if you wanted to expand on that, we'd be happy to hear from it.
Yeah, I think by and large, Napa growers are already pretty far on the far side of the curve in terms of innovation and adoption of practices. So I don't know if there's dramatic changes. I would say that for East Paso, one of the things is water quality. Every well we have down here has some sort of treatment, whether it be sulfuric, citric, water solve, descaler, just putting the investment into making sure that the water you're delivering is as clean and available. It doesn't get bound as it goes into your soil, that it's the right pH for uptake, that it's not going to seal a surface or run off. So water quality is one thing. To Chris's point about some new developments, a lot of our trellis systems are we don't do VSP as much down here, and I think people in Napa have gotten away from a lot of that as well. But a lot of our canopies are split or high wire, a lot of high wire where the canopy is really providing a natural coverage. Your irrigation system, I think Tom and Chris both brought up that you can't do sprinklers late in the season. I disagree. We have a number of ranches with inverted micro sprinks. They use the same water per acre as drip systems, so we have dual systems. Not only can we then, it isn't like a frost protection where they don't have overlapping circles, but rather the circles almost touch. And we use those in heat waves in August, September, just to help build relative humidity within our fruit zone, because again, we have such high temperature, low humidity events in Paso. So you can build systems that will run off your existing wells drip system that will create water throughout your vineyard floor, and continuous drip. We do a lot of inline, mostly because we're cheap, but also because we're able to do, we do a lot of 1/4 gallon per hour and a lot of 1/3 gallon per hour, and then do emitters every 18 to 24 inches. And that just gives you that whole wetted front along your vine row, as opposed to just the 12 inches off a vine trunk. We just found that we weren't expanding our root zone in such a limited water environment. So we really tried to build where the water is delivered and where those roots are going to explore.
Mike touched on it a little bit earlier about sort of Napa and our well management, and sort of investing in that infrastructure here. You deal with drought-like conditions annually down there. And so can you touch on how you manage your water infrastructure and what annual maintenance you do, what investments do you make in that sort of infrastructure setting that we could be utilizing here as well?
Sure.
And Randy, I'm sorry to jump in, but
Mm-hmm.
people are very interested in the micro sprinklers, the the dispersed droplets. I see a lot of those in vineyards in Napa. Could you describe a little more some of those neat systems that you've put in, like at Gateway, like where you put the nozzle or could you talk about that a little more? I think people might be interested in that. And then, sorry, then the other question.
And then go into the boring
Great.
well stuff.
Yeah.
Boring well stuff.
No, micro sprinklers, the way we've chosen to apply it, because we have poor quality water, we can't have the sprinkler actually touch the leaves or the fruit because we would get just calcium deposits and scarring. So our inverted sprinkler heads, they're special heads that can actually be hung upside down and still spray in a circle. They are at about 20 inches. We plant a lot of our vineyards at about 40 inches, 42 inches cordon. The micro sprinks are about 20 inches and just a couple inches off of the drip hose. We actually can we can balance them, or we tie them off to the drip hose as well as its own wire. And so the water spreads in a circle. It's every other row. So that's, and then it's its own drip hose. And that's why it's the same water demand per acre as a drip system. So it's just a second valve that we flip. And we are creating these circle patches that almost touch. They don't quite touch. So you do have some vines that maybe don't see as much of it, but the idea is that during heat events, as we pulse water on here, it raises the humidity and it comes up towards the fruit zone versus overhead sprinklers trying to kind of disperse and drop droplets. We just think of this as maybe a more effective way of using our water, and we can also use it to set cover crop, build soil moisture with some extended sets, that kind of stuff. I'm looking at Tom. Is that a good enough explanation?
Yeah, that's great. I think people would be fascinated by that. That's really neat to hear. I thought those were cool when I saw those.
Yeah, cool. Even better, well information. So yeah, we all of our water is groundwater based. We don't have any things that flow water called rivers that come through here. So first and foremost, have a relationship with a pump company. I understand you guys still have the same Bowden's and McLean Williams and all those folks. Like, if you're not calling them but every 5 or 8 years, don't expect them to answer a phone and help. I mean, we have a very good relationship. In fact, if I turn my camera, it's right outside my window. They actually have an office next door. Good relationship with the pump company that then we gave them an entire book of notes. So they have every one of our drill dates, depth of well, screening level, pump setting, pump horsepower, fuel source, last time it was tested, standing water level, pumping water level, and video. They have a database of that. So when I have a problem, they know exactly what well it is. And then we used to be like an annual maintenance where we bought our own well sounder, we dip and try and figure out what water was doing. Then it went to like every spring and fall, which probably a lot of you do. And now it's quarterly, and we pay a service. They actually do it for us. So when they go out quarterly, they dip our wells. They then also look at the power source. So one of the things you may find in your wells and associated infrastructure is you need to be measuring your voltage in amps to see if there's any loss or imbalance, so you know if there's a failure coming. If you have VFDs, these guys go out and clean out the little air filters in those things. They heat mic it to see if there's any other failures. We really treat our wells as the lifeblood of the vineyard in a lot of cases. And then we probably every 5 to 6 years, we pull that well, we video it. Invariably, even if someone tells you they're going to pull your well and likely everything's fine, they always find something wrong. So if you're going to pull your well, for pulling and putting in a well is probably like $5,000. Just plan on, once you pull it and video it, for videos like $500, they're going to find some degree of debris or blockage in your slots or louvers, whatever you have in your well. Cleaning it's a couple grand up to 10 grand depending on the method. And then invariably some of the piping going down, some of your column pipe needs to replace. So it's a $10,000 or $15,000 when it's all said and done every 5 or 6 years for our wells. But the worst is to have that, and we only do that in the winter. And the worst is to have that well fail on you in the midsummer. And just like probably in Napa, our well companies, even with good relationships, that's weeks without water. So we're pretty aggressive in maintaining that part of our vineyard infrastructure.
Thank you. While I have you, we have some questions in the Q&A box specifically for you. And one question is, what are the foliage evapotranspiration materials that you referred to earlier? Can you give some information about those?
I'll just point you to Enartis has a new product that we've been looking at playing with. Enartis, I'm trying to think of the other chemical company. So I'll say that there's products, Ostastim, O-S-T-O, O-S-T-I-M, Ostastim, Blue Vitae, Lavigne, they're mature. Like these are the type of products. It's fascinating that these, again, focused companies on winery supplies and products, they're coming out with these vineyard divisions that they're using their knowledge and how yeasts and byproducts work and are providing things that at least in the first couple of years, I don't know if I would invest in any of these products if I could, but at this point, they're at least encouraging enough that we keep trying them because we are seeing some differences.
So we're at our hour mark, but we have a handful of other questions. So I just want to make sure that you guys have some time to stay with us for maybe an extra 10 or 15 minutes. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so let's switch gears. We have a question for Chris about rootstock. Rootstock plays a big role in how your vineyard will fare in a season like this. We have a two-part question for you. How do rootstocks behave differently in drought years compared to normal, and what rootstocks are you worried about this year? You've already said one, so any others?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question. A 10114 and Riparia Gloire, for sure. 10114 is so tricky because if you give it a lot of water right now, you'll get a good canopy, but it really tends to senesce early and it doesn't have any drought tolerance, and it'll be extremely difficult for you to keep that canopy later in the season. You're just going to be looking at yellow all across your fruit zone, if not higher, and much earlier than you want to see it. Riparia Gloire has an incredibly shallow root system. Canopy also senesces early, and it will not hold up in a heat spike. It just won't. 1616C will do a bit better than those comparatively for also a lower vigor rootstock, but it's going to need some water. What else? 420A is also a lower vigor rootstock, and it has some drought tolerance because of its root architecture. It's a deeper rooting system, but it's low vigor, so it won't make a big canopy for you. So you could still have some issues later in the season with that. Those are the main rootstocks I'm worried about this year. Yeah. And the main situation that I'm worried about is where you have planted those rootstocks for a very good reason. So you're on a valley floor, you're on something with higher water holding capacity. So you planted a devigorating rootstock. That makes sense. But your site's changed this year. So you don't have that water storage, and you may or may not have that extra water to give. So that's the most challenging situation I see this year compared to somewhere where you've got a drought tolerant rootstock in a droughty soil. That's adapted. That should be okay. Those won't give up without a fight, but it's these lower vigor rootstocks on a heavier soil that I'm most concerned about.
And you mentioned cover crops and talked about that a little bit ago. And we have a question in the Q&A box that I want to direct to you as well. Is a close mow of cover crop almost as good as tilling to reduce water demand of the cover crop?
I think so. I might have Tom answer this after me. A close mow for sure. If you can keep it close mowed, I mean, that's the problem in some of those situations where you have a permanent cover, because you do have some water in the topsoil. It'll stay close mowed for like 2 weeks, and then it'll get back up there. So it depends on how well you can manage it. But yes, if you close mow it, then you have absolutely decreased your evaporative demand. I'm not sure what that number would actually look like compared to just tilling it in. It was to me, people who chose to till it in is because they knew they couldn't go around and mow that 3 or 4 times sort of thing to keep it that close.
Tom, anything to add to that answer?
No, I think that's great. I could talk ad nauseum about anything ET related, so I should cut off because we're running out of time. There's other questions.
Okay, well, we'll move on to you actually. You see a lot of data from all across the state. So our question for you is, how much do growers irrigate in other parts of the state where this year's rainfall is in Napa is sort of typical for their region?
So what I'm hoping to give everyone here is some benchmarks to think about how growers in other parts of the state think about irrigating when they deal with water conditions like this. So I want to start with reminding you guys the numbers from Napa. So in a typical year in Napa State Hospital, it's 28 inches of rain. This year it's been 10. And in the spring, between March and June, growers typically in Napa apply 7 gallons per vine. And in the summer months, June through the end of September, it's 70 gallons. So keep in mind 7 gallons in the spring and 70 in the summer is typical for Napa. And then let's take a look at Monterey. Monterey, the average rainfall is 12 inches, so pretty close to what we got in Napa this year. And in the spring, growers apply 50 gallons per vine. And in the summer, they apply 180 gallons per vine. So they apply, what is that? 7 times more in the spring, 8 times more in the spring, and twice as much, almost, yeah, a little more than twice as much in the summer. And then let's take a look at Paso, where the city of Paso, the average rainfall is 13 inches, and there's a rain gradient from west to east. But I've kind of lumped everything together in my analysis here, everything from West Paso and East Paso. In spring, the growers typically apply about 26 gallons per vine, and in the summer, 130 gallons per vine. So compare that to, again, the typical in Napa is 7 gallons per vine in the spring and 70 gallons per vine in the summer. So it just gives you guys, I hope it gives everyone kind of a sense of what other growers in other parts of the state are applying during similar conditions.
Okay, we have a question about asking if you could review just leaf water potentials for the various growth stages as well, to sort of give a benchmark for that.
I don't know if that one's directed towards me, but I actually think that'd be really interesting from everyone here. I don't know. There's I think it'd be better answered for everyone in the interest of time if it's not the data wonk, guy speaking, but people that are managing vineyards actively. So why don't we start with Mike? We haven't heard from you for a little bit. How do you think about your different leaf water potential targets?
Well, I think the first thing, and it's important, is the number itself is kind of meaningless without the context of the vineyard. We see that, I mean, we have a gazillion leaf water potential sites, and negative 13 bars in one vineyard may mean that you're late with your irrigation. In another vineyard, it may mean that it's totally fine. I think what's more interesting to talk about, and I'd love to hear what Chris and Randy think, in the context of this vintage, and I've had a brief conversation with Tom about it, all of the metrics that we use, whether it's a pressure bomb, whether it's a sap flow sensor, whether it's Thule, it doesn't matter. Should we be thinking about adjusting our thresholds given what this vintage is, and given the other things that we're trying to do? I mean, if we accept, just for the sake of talking, that we're going to have smaller canopies than we're accustomed to, I'm not sure that that's a bad thing in terms of drought tolerance. And Chris touched on 420A, being a less vigorous vine, but thought of as having some drought tolerance. And my sense is because it's a little bit thriftier, because it is a little bit smaller. So do we want to carry that over into our other vineyards? For example, if you've got a block of 3309 and it's on sort of rocky soil, and your typical trigger is minus 12.5 bars. You're going to give it a little bit of water. You know, do you push that a little bit this year? And are you then farming more according to the vintage, the way we were talking about before, or do you keep your quote normal year parameters in an abnormal year?
Okay, I'll chime in. And my leaf water, I completely agree with Mike that my leaf water potential thresholds are block and rootstock dependent and site dependent. They're not necessarily varietal or, you know, I mean, the most important thing for me for quality, we're in Napa, we're all about quality, is trying to achieve some level of moderate stress. So for me, that's a -13, -14 from berry set to veraison. Some years you can't actually do that in Napa on certain soils, and sometimes you can. This year, absolutely. So for your question, Mike, would you lower it or raise it? It completely depends on the rootstock. I've already trashed 1 and 114, but I'll just say that my threshold for that for a lot of spots is like an 11, just because I don't trust it. And I think it could be 13 in like 2 hours. But I agree with you that for the drought tolerant rootstocks, this could be a year when if you're trying to conserve water where you would adjust those benchmarks.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I'd say the only thing that we look at or that we would caution is, you know, no stress during bloom, as Chris had mentioned before. Up to veraison, we're very comfortable at 14, but we also have predominantly 1103P rootstock, so 14 seems to be a good. We don't want it to go over, but if in between 12 and 14, that doesn't freak anyone out. And then the only thing I'd add would be that post that, even though we're adding more water after veraison, it's hard for us actually to drop a leaf water potential, or we use the Thule Vision or some other tools. Hard to drop the number even though we're increasing water, simply because of the other factors that go into evapotranspiration, our heat waves, our wind, everything else happening. So while I think it's good to have triggers that you understand, also be aware that despite your additional water, you may not be moving that needle on a single measurement very much.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I'm gonna ask one final question, and then maybe we have a chance for 1 or 2 more in the Q&A box. So this is a question about sort of farming strategies and communication, communication with your winery partners, communication with the winemakers who buy your clients' fruit. In a year like this, communication is pretty key and very, very important. And so how do you all see yourselves communicating your farming strategies this year and the changes you may have to make to your winery partners and those who are buying your clients' fruits?
I'll start off because I have a funny story, and then actually something that is relevant. But there's a winery down here, or there's a grower down here that he runs out of water almost every fall. He's infamous for telling his winery clients, pick now, or whatever bricks it is, or if you want me to hang it for another couple of weeks, you need to pay me an extra couple $100 per ton. And you look at it, you're like, no, my contract says this, this, and this. And he's like, yeah, well then pick it, because I don't have any more water. So if you want to hang your fruit, you have to pay me a ripening bonus to add water as it goes through harvest. And people are wise to that game now. But yeah, I think in terms of communicating, we have a large winery in this area that is now using some of the free satellite information and looking, it's not real time, but relatively recent, vigor mapping vigor mapping of our vineyards and using it as a proxy for water use. Cal Poly's done a couple of good studies off of this. So we have wineries now very much engaging us in conversations about how much water we're using throughout the season just by looking at satellite imagery. So and I think what that has helped over these last couple of years is now we're sharing a lot of our, whether it be like a Thule tower or our spectral imaging, any of the tools we're using internally, we're now giving logins to wineries saying, hey, you buy from this ranch, here's the information, here's our soil moisture sensors. One, because there's already a good relationship there, so it's not we're not concerned about the transparency. But two, it involves them in the risk reward of how we're farming that fruit. So I think that it makes that conversation easier with the winery, like, hey, you see that we don't have a whole lot of soil moisture. We need to be thinking about, don't schedule this pick 2 weeks out. I think we're within a week, because I just don't know what the canopy is going to do given this curve of depletion. So I would say being open and maybe sharing some of your technology with your buyers can be a good tool with the right partner.
Mike, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's important that we communicate, and Chris said it before, this is Napa Valley, it's all about quality. And I think we need to communicate to our winery partners that everything that we do in this difficult vintage is oriented towards quality, but it's not without paying attention to the long-term health of the vines. That there may be some things that we do that seem to fly in the face of quality, if you will. And I think, we just need to be prepared to explain those things. It is a partnership, but at the end of the day, in my business, our primary responsibility is to the vineyard owner. Certainly we have a huge responsibility to the winemakers that are buying that fruit, but I think just, open and honest communication about why we're doing something. Somebody goes out to the vineyard, for their however frequent, drive around it is, and the water is on at a time that they're not accustomed to seeing the water being on. Well, we should be able to explain that to them. We should have a reason for what we're doing, and we should remember where our primary responsibilities lie. And communication is a two-way street. We need to have winery partners that understand what we're trying to do, and that ultimately it's to their benefit.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add at all. Those are all great comments. The only thing that also worries me and that I think about again is younger vines that might have a fruit contract for this year. Those might be some hard decisions, and those are conversations you should have early about whether it makes sense in a first year of cropping in a year like this to ask that of the vines.
All right. Well, I think we are officially over time and out of time, but I really appreciate all of your participation today. We have a few questions for those of you that we didn't get to answer that we will send in our follow-up. So rest assured that we will get some answers to some of the questions that we didn't get to today. We should have scheduled an hour and a half. This is a really robust and big topic. But thank you all again. We'll send the recording along with the notes and some best practices for farming in drought years that MVG is preparing to all attendees afterwards. And please, for those participants, before you log off, there'll be a little survey that pops up. Oh, there it is, I think. Hopefully you can see that. That will help us maintain our grant funding to continue to provide programs like this. So thank you all again, and we will see you hopefully at the next one.